So now we're going to touch on some of the themes, hopefully, that I helped to seed. Our first speaker, so we're going to actually really try to have the 10 minutes of Q&A, or I should say 20 minutes of Q&A. So please think about questions while you're hearing the speakers and be prepared. We'll have a roaming mic. But first up, we're going to have Susan Alpert, who's going to talk about what does FDA need and or want in support of neuromodulation devices. Please join me in welcoming Susan.
So I'm going to echo, write your questions down, because that's what it has to be all about. And what I've done, what I want to talk about, there's a session tomorrow, and tomorrow you're going to hear about what does FDA actually do, what are all the processes and things. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how do you, as innovators, as investors, whatever your role is, how do you understand what the FDA is going to want to know and want to see? And how do you find that out? How can you be prepared? As you've already heard, you need to think about what's the regulatory material that I'm going to need to have in order to get to the market. Well, it's not just get to the market, it's get to patients. You have to have FDA's permission for your clinical trials. So how do you know what you're going to need to give them? How do you know what you're going to need to provide? How do you get there? How do you understand for what stages what you're going to need? So I thought I'd spend some time on that, because that's not something that's written down somewhere that you can easily find. So that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I don't really have any disclosures for this talk. I work with a lot of small companies. I used to work with big companies. I also work with small companies. And what I do is translate. I translate what the regulator says and wants, and what the innovator needs to bring, needs to understand. So I'm the translator. So what does FDA really want? They want to know, who are you treating? What are you treating? Real, clear understanding of what that is. Who are the patients? Ages, gender, ethnicity. All of those influence how technology works. What does it do? How does it do it? And then the requirement is to establish that it's safe and effective, but it's not 100% of either. Reasonable safety, reasonable evidence of efficacy, that the benefits outweigh the risks. Everything has benefits, we hope. We hope everything you do has benefits. And we know everything has risks. So it's the benefits outweighing the risks. And what do you need to bring to do that? And I'm going to talk about that. They also care about users. Who is going to use this device? Is it something that's going to be used by an MD, by a technical person, by the nurse, by the patient, by the family? Who's going to use it? And how are you training that person? And can they operate this device safely? So those are the kinds of things that FDA wants to know. I'm not going to talk about what the different paths to market are. As I said, there's a conversation tomorrow by the FDA, by current FDA people, to talk about what are the tools, what's the pathways. But how do you figure out what you need to bring, what you need to develop in order to have that conversation? So I'm going to talk about that. So the only thing I'm going to say about the different pathways to FDA, I'm not going to tell you how to figure out what they do and all that stuff, but to understand that there are differences in the kinds of data and the amounts of data that you're going to need to bring. So you need to figure these things out. You need to know these things early. You already heard that regulatory brought in several times that you need to be looking at what's the regulatory requirement? What's the regulatory pathway so that you are preparing your product and your information in order to move forward? The interesting thing on this slide, and the slides are meant for you to look at later, the interesting thing about medical technology that not everybody understands is not every product needs to bring new clinical data. Not every product needs to bring new clinical data. Most do, and in this field, the vast majority do. But not every single product needs a big, expensive, randomized, concurrently controlled clinical trial. There are lots of different models of the development of clinical data, and there are lots of different kinds of requirements for need. So it's not one size fits all. So how do you figure out which size you have, what you need? So we're going to talk about that. Well, the only people who know are the regulators, and how in the world do you find that out? Well, there are lots of tools. Yes, there is. You can ask. We'll talk about asking. But you can't just, FDA wants to work with you. FDA is very excited about new technology. FDA people, they're us. They're engineers, they're doctors, they're technologists. They all have families. FDA wants new products. The people at FDA are us. They want new products to enter the market. They want new things that will advance healthcare. But they're not allowed to tell you what to do. They can't tell you. But you can ask and propose and get responses. So I'm going to tell you some of the things that you need to look at and use in order to figure out what should you be telling them so that you can ask, is this okay? Do I need more? Do I need something different? This is what I understand as the innovator. This is what I understand I need to bring to you. Did I get it right? That's a question you can ask. You can't go in and say, well, how many patients do I need? And is this the right preclinical testing? And is this the right engineering? That they're not allowed to answer. But if you say, I'm going to design a study and it's going to have this many patients and this many controls, we're going to study for 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years, this is how we're going to do it, is that going to be the data you need? That they can answer. Well, how do you figure that part out? Again, tools. FDA communicates in ways that they can with the public. So how is that? There's guidance. Everybody says, oh yeah, there's guidance. Well, guidance is after FDA has experience with a number of products of the same type, doing the same thing for the same indication, for the same population, then they can write guidance and say, for the next guys, now we've got 4 or 5 of them, now we're going to have more of them. Here are the things we want to see. Sharing their experience through guidance. But it's not law. It's recommendation. Because if you have something that doesn't fit, you've got something novel, you've got something new. You may follow part of the guidance and then say, but I can't do that. That's okay. You propose to them how you use the guidance to learn those things, and then what else you need. Regulations are different. I put it up there just to remind you. Guidance and regulation are 2 different things. Regulation is law. It has the force of law. So if FDA writes a regulation and the descriptions of each type of device, there's something called the Code of Federal Regulations and Section 21. So 21 CFR is all the FDA stuff. And then there are numbers. And those things are regulations. They describe a category of devices. That is law. It has the force of law. But they don't describe the guide. They don't tell you how to do it. They don't tell you what to bring. They just describe what's the category. And if you're in a category, then you have to figure out, okay, so what do I bring and what do I compare to? So those are the things that you can do. Guidance does that. It's formal, it's published, it's available on the FDA website, not always easy to use, but you can get there. And guidance is strongly recommended, it's not law. So if your device doesn't fit, you can propose something different. So what I'm telling you is there are tools for you to be able to use the regulatory process. Very important, as people were saying, you can talk to them. Yes, you can. Well, you can, but FDA on the device side regulates 15,000 companies. They can't talk to everybody all the time. It's a little hard when there's 15,000 submitters. So there's a process for that. Pre-submission process, it's formalized. You have to tell them what's your device, what's the intended use, who are you treating, what's the testing you're going to do, a table of what's all the testing you're going to do or planning to do, what you've done, not full reports, but here's all the things. Here's how I'm testing my materials. Here's how I'm testing my design. Here's how I'm sterilizing my device, making sure that it's biocompatible and all those wonderful things. Here's how I want to do my clinical work. And then you're asking, is that enough? Have I hit all the things you need? Is there anything in addition you're going to need to see? Things like that. That's how you have the conversation, because they can't tell you. They don't know your device. You have to tell them, what are you thinking, what are you planning, and how are you going to do that? You have that conversation, you document it it's not minutes, it's not word by word, it's documenting what was agreed to. And if there were agreements, they're binding. So even if the reviewers change, because it takes you 1.5 years or 2 years to bring your product to them, if it was agreed to in a conversation, in a pre-submission, it's binding on you and on them. And if you're going to change, if something's come up, you need to tell them. You need to have that conversation. So those are important issues. When you have a conversation with FDA, you can bring lots of topics. There's only one problem, and that is they will only do one meeting on each topic. So you can do something high level, which is not detailed, and then do some more detailed ones. Or if they ask for more detail, if they ask for more data, you can do other meetings on the same topic. But you have to think, you have to plan. Again, they've got 15,000 people, 15,000 companies that talk to them. They can't have individualized conversations, and they have to have consistency within their teams, within their groups. So they have to prepare. So you can understand why they can't just, pick up the phone and answer. So you need to have a program for them. Almost done. You can actually see what FDA has done with other products. And strongly, I advise you to do that. You can look at the summaries of safety and effectiveness for already cleared or approved, already marketed products. You can see the kinds of data. You're not going to see the detail of the study designs, because that's proprietary. So they don't publish how they did it, how the company did it, but what kinds of data were developed. What did FDA need to see? I can't tell you for each of these kinds of products, but there is a way to find it. Summaries of safety and effectiveness, PMA summaries, 510K summaries, de novo summaries. They're all summarized. They're all published on the FDA website. You just need to look for them. And that tells you a lot about what FDA is going to want to see about your product, the kinds of data that they're going to need to see. There's also clinicaltrials.gov. Everybody know clinicaltrials.gov? If you want to know what somebody else is doing, look at clinicaltrials.gov, because they all have to be there. FDA does not accept data for trials that have not been listed on one of the public databases. So if it's done in the US, it's on clinicaltrials.gov. There are international databases that list clinical trials. They all need to be, your trials need to be published somewhere, or FDA can't accept the data. So that's really important. And then for class 3 products and for really novel, even class 1 and class 2 products, FDA has public meetings. They're recorded. You can get the presentations. You can go to the meeting. You can hear the questions. You can find out what was FDA thinking, what were the advisors, their panels of advisors thinking. All those things are accessible to you. And you need to use them because they will save you a lot of time and money and keep you figuring out what are the pathways. And you don't have to do what's the final product. There are things you can do along the way. You can stage your work and get there. You just have to know where to go. FDA also talks at public meetings. They are not allowed to create new rules in presentations, but they can explain, they can answer, and you can talk to them. You can't ask your specific question about your product, but you can ask the general questions. So if they're speaking where you are, you want to go listen. They also talk to the trade association, so you have to look at not just the public meetings for your industry, but I mean for your clinical community like this, but you need those other meetings. You have to keep an eye on where are they talking. So I said not every product needs clinical data. I'll give you some statistics. If you are class 3, you need clinical data. Except if you have a technology that's been in the market for more than 6 years. There's something called the 6-year rule. Nobody knows about the 6-year rule. The 6-year rule says if you've got, so I signed the first deep brain stimulator, I don't want to tell you how long ago. So if you are in that realm, not every product needs clinical data, even in PMA class 3. Surprise? Most people are. You'll need bench data, you'll need animal data. You may not need as much clinical data as you think because there are ways to leverage other available data. For PMAs, it's after 6 years. For 510Ks, it's out there. So pay attention to what's been done. Use all of that data. It can save you lots of time, it can save you lots of money, and it can be incredibly informative for the basis of a conversation with FDA to show that you know what they did. And so you're asking the really specific question about your product. It will leverage you with them, collaborate with them. As I said, there's a way to do that. You have to propose. You can't just ask, but they will collaborate with you. They want new products in the market as badly as you do. And you can see that on the announcements they make when they announce brand new product, they publish. So they are a partner, but they're a limited liability partner. There are things they can't do, but there are things that they can do. So use them. And I think that's it.
So our next speaker, Cynthia Kubu at Cleveland Clinic. Unfortunately, she had issues with her travel, so she's going to have to give her talk remote online.
So thank you very much for this invitation. I want to thank Tay and the rest of the planning committee, and also just to express my disappointment that I can't be with you because there's a lot of interesting conversations going on and I would love to engage in them in person. What I'm going to do is just go through kind of lessons learned when we think about translation of neuromodulation devices and neuroethics perspective. I do have some disclosures. I've been My research has been funded by the NIH, and I'm serving on the executive board of the Ethics Committee for the American Psychological Association. They are not responsible for any of my comments today. I also have a broad team. We have a research team that's very important. You're going to recognize some of these names because they're well known in neuromodulation. And then also, I was fortunate enough to work with an international group to help design ethical guidelines in the use of neuromodulation for neuropsychiatric disorders. So I am a neuropsychologist. I'm not an ethicist. A neuropsychologist sweet spot is at that intersection between functional neuroanatomy, behavior broadly defined, and really we know how to measure, we know statistics, and we know research design. And in my role as a neuropsychologist, for over 3 decades, I've had the fortune to work with functional neurosurgery teams, including epilepsy teams, deep brain stimulation teams, and had the opportunities to literally interview thousands of patients who are looking at having an elective neurosurgery because of incapacitating symptoms, whether it be seizures, psychiatric symptoms, movement disorders, and so on. And that provides a very unique insight in terms of why patients want to undergo surgery, what's motivating them to do so, and how those surgeries, as well as the underlying diseases, can impact their function, including important aspects of behavior such as who we are. My research is very much based on the American philosophical tradition of pragmatism, which it shouldn't be a surprise because one of the founding fathers, William James, was the father of psychology in the United States. And just a couple tenets of pragmatism is that pragmatism puts forth that empirical methods are a useful tool for addressing questions, including ethical questions. Another key component of pragmatism is that experiential knowledge is important, i.e. different stakeholders' perspectives and the impact of context on moral agents. And most importantly, what drives my research is that truth and ideas is their power to work. Truth and ideas is their power to work. So in sum, good ethics are based on good data. So what is neuroethics? Well, Roski's definition is it's the ethics of neuroscience, or what are some of the unique ethical questions that come about in the science we do, including the clinical science we do that entail the nervous system. But it's also the neuroscience of ethics and how do our neuroscientific discoveries, such as studying morality, inform ethics scholarship. There are a whole host of people that are engaged in neuroethics scholarship, but Wexler and Specker-Sullivan recently criticized the field of neuroethics, which is a bit over 20 years now, for being too speculative and insufficiently skeptical. Too speculative in terms of not relying necessarily on good data, and insufficiently skeptical because believing that things that are truly fiction or science fiction can come about and occur, such as complete mind control and spending an inordinate amount of time on things when there are too many other pressing neuroethical questions we need to address. Some have pushed back that why do we need neuroethics? Isn't this just bioethics in general? But I would say no, because there's something very unique about the brain and the nervous system. And I'm going to outline a couple of the things that we need to consider in talking about that. So Wexler and Specker-Sullivan also push for this concept of translational neuroethics, which mirrors a lot of the work that I've been trying to do in my lab, but they stated it much, much more eloquently. In that, in order for neuroethics scholarship to be impactful, i.e. truth and ideas is their power to work, we need to be integrated with neuroscientists, frontline physicians, neuropsychologists, patients, biomedical engineers, and I would say even more specifically, research design experts. And it needs to be inclusive. The field of neuromodulation has largely been devoted to helping patients who are among the most privileged. They tend to be white, they tend to be older and well-educated, and that's a problem in terms of healthcare disparities. So I'm not going to discuss a number of very important critical things when you think about translational neuroscience, such as the importance of solid empirical data to justify human studies, consent and vulnerability, which is a particular challenge for physician investigators, the need for interdisciplinary teams, you've heard this theme already with the presentations this morning, and post-trial obligations, which is a huge challenge and something that I've had the privilege to work on with a recent project. What I am going to discuss is public perceptions and stigma. Tim's talk touched on this a bit. Something that's been critical to all of my work, and that is, are we measuring what matters? And why does this matter? So cultural narratives are out there. And in this audience, we don't think about the impact of these fictional cultural narratives, these science fiction narratives, but they're out there. And they entail kind of this kind of alienation. If you have a device in your brain, your body, you're alienated. You're not really who you are. There's the threat of control and mind control, very dystopian. And that narrative matters because those are the narratives that many of our patients are coming to us by. This is their understanding of neuromodulation. And there's clear concerns about the invasiveness of these devices and will it fundamentally change who they are. And this is at any level of the nervous system, I think. You can see this, but particularly for brain implanted devices. This is not solely limited to these historical fictional narratives, and that we know in 2008, Gisquet wrote a paper in a neuroethics journal that said that deep brain stimulation can be a uniquely disruptive experience for patients because of a loss of control of the illness, one's life, and unwanted deleterious personality changes. Following that, there was this big burst of papers in the neuroethics literature that essentially view this as a truism, that neuromodulation results in all these losses of control, autonomy, personality, identity, and so on. And Gilbert wrote about this speculative bubble, and he noted that if you look here, as he divided, most of the papers were conceptual or more ivory tower kind of isolated thought pieces. Very little had any kind of patient-reported data, and most of those were not done with the most rigorous of methods. But there was this bubble out there. Tim referenced this essay as well, and it's not only kind of in this isolated ivory tower of neuroethics scholarship, it's out there in the New Yorker and other narratives that deep brain stimulation, neuromodulation can cause these really profound changes. Theoretically, it can, depending on those neural networks. But the thing is it doesn't for most of us because we're aware of that and we use good science and our functional neuroanatomy to figure out how to address those concerns or potential concerns. What do the real data say? I'm just going to throw a little bit of our data out here just to illustrate that. We studied this in terms of personality changes after DBS. We used standard measures and found very few changes on a whole host of standard measures. And none of those group changes exceeded what I would call a clinical meaningful difference, and then it was a change of only a couple of points, far less than a standard deviation change. We also looked at it from the patient's perspective and asked the patients to identify what are those characteristics you most fear losing at all in terms of your personality. We had them rate how much do you embody that characteristic, with 10 being the greatest and the least. We averaged their top 3, and they retrospectively rated their personality on those top personality characteristics prior to Parkinson's disease, prior to DBS, and then a prospective fashion after DBS. We did this with patients and with their care partners, and we show very clearly that DBS, both at a group level and individual level, was restorative to what patients felt was most important about their personality. So in summary, the notion that neural implants can result in unwanted deleterious changes to important aspects of personality is viewed as a truism by many, even though empirical data based on patients' values and standard tests suggest otherwise. The stigma and fear may dissuade patients from seeking out viable therapies, especially historically marginalized and underrepresented patients. Satisfaction gap. 2006, Ajit and Shupak published this very influential paper. The doctor is happy, the patient less so. We studied this. Why is there this mismatch between what the physicians think is a successful outcome and what patients are saying? We used a mixed method study looking at consecutive series of patients approved for DBS to treat Parkinson's disease. They identified their top 3 symptom and personal goals for surgery and the extent to which they were in control of those goals. And we once again looked at control ratings in a prospective fashion. Now, I don't want to go too much into this study, but the important thing here is that what we see is that what patients, the goals and motivations that patients, that drove patients' desire to seek out neuromodulation, one, were not measured in most outcome measures. We're not measuring them. And furthermore, they had to do with those things that are most fundamental to who we are as humans, our relationships with people, our ability to play and enjoy things that we truly enjoy, our hobbies, our avocations, some basic activities of living, which are covered in many measures, work, meaningful work, volunteer, paid work, work in the home, work in the yard. And oddly enough, driving came up in the context of PD. So these general kind of buckets, if you will, of the variables that motivate patients to seek out neuromodulation, we've seen that with epilepsy patients as well. And we've seen similar themes arising with patients with tremor. Importantly, as I said, most of these changes in the scores were unrelated to standard of care measures like the Parkinson's disease quality of life, UPDRS. There's a mismatch there. Why is this important? Well, we know that standard of care measures do not fully capture what is most important to patients. It's not just in the PD world, our tremor. We've also seen it, and others have documented with OCD, with depression, and we know that with our own data that most personality tests don't measure how patients think about personality. This contributes to poor communication and mismatched expectations. I often state that when we think about this, I've got a patient who's coming in and they want surgery to address their tremor. The surgeon, the neurologist think, hey, that's a reasonable goal. We can reduce your tremor. But they want to reduce the tremor so they can get back in the OR. And there may be many other reasons why they're never going to get back in the OR. So they come back, tremors reduced, but they are still not in the operating room and they're not happy because they're not functioning as a surgeon as they used to. And this can impact translational science as well. It can clearly impact treatment planning and inform consent because we're talking about different ideas of outcome and how we measure it. Meaning of a failed trial. So just briefly, and some of you are going to know far more about these trials than I do, but North Star's Everest trial was a cortical stimulation plus rehab versus rehab trial to look at motor recovery, I think, following stroke. And the primary endpoint was 4 weeks after surgery, and there was no significant difference. So they kind of aborted that trial, despite the fact that over time they realized that if there was better lead localization and that other mechanisms that some patients did sustain benefit. Reclaim and Broaden were both industry-sponsored DBS trials for treatment-resistant depression. They failed futility analyses, and the studies were terminated based on financial decisions because there wasn't enough of a signal, and at least with Reclaim, there wasn't enough of, they didn't have sufficient power to see if there was going to be a signal or anyway. But they aborted those trials, but it was not because of patient safety concerns. Why is this important? Because in terms of ethics, and we've written on this, is that the focus was on those who didn't respond versus those who did. And the message is out there that this is a failed trial. What does that mean to those patients who had a response? Does that mean that their response is not legitimate? Does it mean that they're imagining this? There's a loss of benefit to those patients who did respond when the trial ended. This looks at those post-trial obligations. Furthermore, we've argued there's lost knowledge opportunity in patients already implanted. You've already enrolled patients in a trial with an implanted device where you may be able to further learn and probe. And so there's that scientific kind of challenge that we have, or the opportunity. Clearly, patient safety takes precedent, but there's an opportunity here to learn, and the patients may want to continue with that. In addition, we know that as you waited longer out and extended the trial, many of these patients who didn't meet that primary endpoint did sustain benefit later. So there are these public and scientific misperceptions that a failed therapy or a failed trial means a failed hypothesis. And that was evident in the public and the scientific communities. So what are some of the implications for translational research? I think it's critically important to think of our trial design. And I think we're wedded to the notion of a randomized controlled clinical trial as being the ultimate goal. And I would encourage us to think about the New York Times essay from several years ago is, do we really need a randomized clinical control trial to demonstrate that flossing our teeth is good for us? Furthermore, I'd encourage us to think back in terms of the philosophy of science and Kuhn's argument that we shouldn't necessarily be constrained by past methods or resources and ways of thinking about how to answer scientific questions, and that maybe we can start being more innovative in our trial designs, particularly if you have an implanted device, and try and convert those who didn't respond to responders by using data from those who responded. And that's been very nicely demonstrated by Helen Mayberg's group in a Riva Posse paper from years ago. Should we consider these more iterative, fluidive designs? I think the other thing that this highlights to me is that there are limitations of current outcome measures, which may not reflect the treatment goals of a diverse, broad sample of our population. Can we develop better outcome measures? And then also there's this real issue of the public perception and the continued viability of potential therapy. And I think that's really important. And that's why the stress and the tensions in this field, I think, are so interesting and difficult sometimes to navigate because of these public perceptions, because of the costs associated with implantable devices. We need to be mindful of doing things right the first time because we may not always have a second time. So neuroethicists' role, I think, are to challenge negative and stigmatizing narratives using data. That's kind of weird how it came out. Partner with others to advocate for ethical trial designs. Integrate patients' values into study design via development of new measures that prioritize patients' perspectives and understandings of treatment success. And I think that bottom line, good ethics are based on good data. And we do this by building bridges, by respecting different ways of knowing, doing, and thinking, and working an interdisciplinary team with clear attention to justice issues and the fact that a lot of our data is constrained in terms of inadequate representation of underrepresented and historically marginalized individuals. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Cynthia. As we get John ready and get his slides up, there's another one from the British Medical Journal, which always does a kind of a joke issue once a year, and it's on the randomized control trial for whether you should use a parachute when jumping out of a plane. And so that's another one to look up. And they actually did it absolutely straight in terms of the trial design and the controls and the like. But they end the article by saying how they failed to recruit for their control group. So, so it's my pleasure to finish the formal talks with John Rondoni, an old colleague, coming in and talking about their experience at Inspire from concept to clinic, translating a novel closed-loop therapy. So please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Tim. Both Susan and Tim are old colleagues from Medtronic, and I see a lot more out here. It's a pleasure to see you all. And my current role, I have the honor and pleasure of working with all of these smart folks here. And the work that I'm going to be presenting today is largely theirs. I also work with some other early stage companies as well, trying to help them navigate the process of bringing their innovations to market. But for the purposes of this talk, I think the most important qualification is that I'm very excited and enthusiastic about the work that's happening here, the promise of the therapies that are being worked on that can literally read and understand your thoughts, that can teach your central nervous system how to heal itself and work better. These are amazing technologies, and we have an incredibly bright future ahead of us. And so what I'm hoping to contribute with this talk is a perspective of having gone through a lot of this work of translating a concept to a marketed therapy, and hopefully present some ideas that can help you as you think about bringing some of these new innovations to market. So briefly, Inspire Medical Systems treats obstructive sleep apnea, which is a lack of breathing during sleep caused by a relaxation of the soft tissues of the upper airway during sleep. It's currently treated with CPAP in almost all patients, which is continuous positive airway pressure, where we actually splint the airway open by inflating it. And if it was comfortable to sleep like this with a vacuum cleaner filling you with air, Inspire would not exist. So this is the process that we went through at Inspire, and I think that this is the process at a high level that most therapies go through on their way to translate from an early concept to the market. And so I want to share with you briefly what our experience has been as we went through this process. In the early 90s, this concept for Inspire stimulation, or stimulation of the upper airway muscles to restore normal tone so you could have breathing normal when you're sleeping, was really demonstrated as an early concept. But there were a lot of challenges that were also identified with the technology and the patient selection. And this caused the therapy to go through a long pause while it was considered, how do we redesign this product? Is it worth to invest in this product? And it wasn't until 2007 when Medtronic ultimately decided to spin this technology out to a third-party company to pursue it, that Inspire was founded and we were able to move forward. This is when I joined the company, and initially we had to figure out how to solve those product problems and start those trials again. And we were able to identify that there are certain patients populations that are going to respond better and some that are not. And so we learned a lot about patient selection. We learned a lot about how to manage those patients in these early feasibility trials with tens of patients. But we were able to demonstrate safety and efficacy to an extent that we were able to then take it to the FDA and start a pivotal trial. This ultimately led to studying in over 100 patients and FDA approval in 2014. But if you just look at the timeline here, it took about 25 years to go from concept to that first 150 patients and to FDA approval. It's a long and torturous route. After that, we had to focus on broadening adoption of this therapy, getting coding, coverage, and payment in place. We were fortunate in that there were existing codes for cranial neuromodulation that we could leverage. This dramatically sped it up, but it still took us 6 years to get broad coverage in the US and some respectable coverage in Europe. And then by 2020, we'd implanted about 10,000 patients worldwide. Since then, we've been focusing on investing in the therapy to grow the adoption of it, to improve patient access, to improve outcomes, but also on the digital services that make it easier to identify and manage patients. And to date, we've recently passed about 60,000 patients worldwide. So it's been a long route. But this same path will be followed by the new therapies that you are all working on today. And when I talk to new companies that are working on this, they're oftentimes thinking about it the same way that someone running the hurdles thinks about it, which is, I've got to get over the next point, the next trial, the next data point so that I can get the next round of funding, right? And this is altogether appropriate because that's how you have to move through this process. But what I would like to suggest is that there are certain strategic considerations that need to be thought about early on. And Tim and Susan and Cynthia mentioned some of these. If we think about these big picture things as we're moving through this process, the likelihood of success will be much greater. And so there's 3 of these that I want to talk about today in particular. The first is outcomes measurements. How are we going to demonstrate that the therapy that we're working on works? The care pathway. How are those patients going to move through the process to get this therapy? And then ultimately the product design. How can we build a system that can be practically used? So I'm going to comment a little on each of these 3 and then talk to you about how Inspire thought about this and what we learned, and hopefully that will enlighten you all. Because while I'm not an expert on spinal cord stimulation or deep brain stimulation, I think a lot of these concepts do translate. For outcomes measurement, we're really choosing the playing field. We're choosing how we're going to be judged, which is a tremendous opportunity to think deeply about what it is that we're trying to do. And it's one that cannot be overlooked. We have to choose an outcome measure that ultimately will be accepted by the clinicians and payers and patients. But we also want to make sure that we're going to be successful in the chosen patient population. We want to make sure that it's going to be cost effective and practical, which sometimes might be harder than you think. Boy, we can run this study and our outcome will be this change in this fMRI metric. Well, that's pretty difficult, but if, let's say, we have a patient at home with a scale and we're seeing if we can reduce weight or increase weight, well, that's a little bit more straightforward from a measurement standpoint. Objective measurements are obviously very, very important, but subjective are incredibly important as well. Does the patient feel better at the end of the day is as important as whether or not you change the number of apneas that they had during a day. And then what is the effect size given those measures of the current standard of care, assuming that there is one, right? And then for your intervention, perhaps it's going to cost quite a bit more because it's an expensive neuromodulation device. How much better do you need to be than that standard of care to justify it? Tim mentioned quality of life years, right? Qualities are a great way to think about this. So for Inspire, we had the benefit of having an existing diagnostic tool that also provided an outcomes measure, which is a sleep study or a polysomnogram. This is standardized by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine here in the US, and it's a way to measure the number of apneas and hypopneas per hour. All you have to do is hook the patient up to all of this gear, and then you can measure their respiratory effort, their airflow, their blood oxygenation levels, and their central nervous system activity, and you're done, right? So, is it cost-effective and practical? Somebody's saying no. Well, actually, it turns out that it is really cost-effective. It's kind of counterintuitive because sleep doctors get paid really, really well to do this. They're really excited about doing it, right? And this is how they diagnose all of their patients today. So it actually is kind of cost-effective in the market. But it's not particularly practical because it's kind of hard to do this. You can't do it at home. But the good news is that for $189, you can take one of these home today, and you can be tested and ready to go. Modern technology has been changing how this diagnostic is being applied, and so there is an opportunity in our space at least to get some good measurements at home. Maybe it's not the gold standard. Maybe the FDA isn't going to accept that, but it gives us great insight into what's happening with our therapy. It's pretty good. This is lofted, by the way, if you're looking for a sleep test. But you don't even need insurance for that one. If you have insurance, it's less expensive but slower. So there you go. I don't know what to say about that. AHI is also linked to mortality. So this is a good thing. So the number of apneas and hypopneas that are happening an hour not only provide an objective measurement to the severity of the disease, but we've been able to link that disease to outcomes that matter to patients, living or not, right? And so we can also start to look at this and see how severe that is linked to an effect size. So we can see, look, if you go from 15 to 30, your mortality risks go way up. So if we can reduce the AHI by 10 to 15, all of a sudden we can have a great effect. That's awesome. Here's the challenge. If I test anybody 2 nights in a row, the chance that they're going to switch categories is about 40%, right? So when we think about our measures, we need to think about this practicality element as well, right? Do we really understand what we're doing? Because when we create an arbitrary threshold for inclusion or passing a study, this can be a challenge. Now, this can be managed. You just test multiple nights. You look at averages, things like that, and that's what we've done. But it's an important thing to think about when you're selecting an outcome measure. So, I don't know what all the outcome measures are going to be for deep brain stimulation and spinal cord stimulation, but I think that if we can apply some of these principles, they're going to be ones that are going to make it easier for investors to say, yes, I understand how this is going to be a game changer. It's going to be easier for clinicians to say, yes, I want to use this in my day-to-day practice, right? And if we can link these to subjective outcomes, subjective benefit to the patient, then I think we really are playing with fire, or playing with something that matters. I don't know if that's the right analogy there. Think about that. Care pathway. This is incredibly important. So if you have a new innovation, but there's not a clinician group who can apply it, that's a challenge, right? Good news is that there are these multidisciplinary clinics for patients who are going through rehabilitation from spinal cord injury. There are these multidisciplinary clinics for people who are going through rehabilitation for stroke. So there are some great opportunities out there. But for Inspire, this has been a real challenge to figure out how patients are going to navigate through this system. And I think for any new innovation, it is. One of the key challenges is just, does the patient even know that they need this, right? There's probably a couple people in this room who need a stent right now and you have no idea. But you'll have a heart attack and you'll get one, right? Well, that makes it a bit of a challenge to find those patients on a prospective basis. So, do the patients know that they need this disorder or that they need this treatment for their disorder? And then what's the value ultimately they're bringing to both the clinicians and the payers? So, for Inspire, we were lucky to have a therapy that was out there that's a standard of care, which is CPAP. And there was a lot of data around that. There was a good diagnostic. So this was very, very helpful. We also have a very large treatment population. So in the US, every year about 2 million CPAPs are prescribed. 50 to 65% of those patients are compliant. And then if you look at those who have anatomies that are suitable for Inspire, you end up about 500,000 patients a year that should be eligible for this treatment. We just completed, after 35 years, about 60,000 patients. It's a long process. Good news is that there's good economic basis for treating this population as well. So Cynthia is from Cleveland Clinic, so I'll share a little bit of Cleveland Clinic data from their retrospective look at how patients are moving through their system. So they diagnosed patients with obstructive sleep apnea. They apply PAP. They followed those patients through a workflow if they were compliant or not, if they used PAP or not, if they needed to be referred or not. And they found that after 3 years, 44% of the patients that they had diagnosed were lost to follow-up. They didn't know where they were, even if they were untreated. So this is a huge challenge because you have patients who you know need a treatment like Inspire, but they're not being seen by any doctor. So how do you solve that problem, right? And if there isn't a way to solve that problem, to get those patients coming in and saying, hey, I want to try this therapy, you're going to have a much harder problem getting adoption. Because at the beginning, you have a little data. You've got 150 patients, and you're asking a doctor to change how they've been treating patients for the last 20 years. Having patients who are motivated and interested is a really key part of that process, right? So the way that we've addressed it is by running ads. Patients have tried a CPAP. They don't like it. You're still not sleeping well. Your bed partner is telling you you're snoring. Come back to your doctor and ask about Inspire. From a value perspective, we already talked about all-cause mortality being a key one. There's all sorts of expensive cardiovascular consequences to obstructive sleep apnea, which is also a lever for us to engage with some of the highly integrated systems like a Kaiser and say, hey, connect with these patients, manage these patients. They're going to need ablation for atrial fibrillation. They're going to need a pacemaker. They're going to need a cardiac monitor. But also those patients who are not using their treatment for obstructive sleep apnea are incredibly expensive for the healthcare system overall. And so this has been an important lever for getting payers excited about reimbursing Inspire and getting employers excited about their covered lives, their employees using it. So we've talked about how we should think about measuring outcomes. We've talked a little bit about how patients move through the system and how those should be affecting how we think about our therapy from the earliest stages. And I think if with the early steps of doing feasibility of this, keeping those things in mind is going to be critical because we'll make the right measures, we'll ask the right questions of our doctors, and we'll think about this therapy being applied in the right way so that those early steps ultimately will bear the right fruit and get the right interest from the investors and business community. So, product design. It's incredibly important to build something that people want to use and not you all, right? Engineers like to use things that normal people don't. And so I'd like to recommend my mother for this. If you have a product that you're not sure, I'd love you to come over and have her use it. She's an amazing woman, but she's an interior designer, right? And so I spend a lot of time helping her with her computer. And that's just the normal thing, right? But we need to build these products that are going to be an intimate part of people's lives, and it's got to be that easy to use so that she doesn't have to call me to get it fixed. Closed-loop technology is going to be an important part of doing this, but there's a downside, and that it's really complicated to deliver those kind of solutions, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all. Finally, and I think this is incredibly important, and Nick Mayers from Inspire is going to be talking later about this, but the digital infrastructure has to be a core part of how we think about bringing new therapies to market. The opportunity that digital technology gives us to manage and monitor our clinical trials is so valuable that it just has to be used from day one so that we can learn faster, we can adapt faster, and we can take better care of our patients. So at Inspire, we think about these folks as our different customers, right? We have our surgeons who install the product. We have our sleep doctors who manage the patients. We have the patient themselves, and then we have the hospital administrators who have to make this whole thing economically work. And unfortunately, sleep doctors and ENTs don't really like working together historically, so this has been a major challenge for us to kind of create new pathways where they're going to collaborate. I think in some of the areas where you all are working, these multidisciplinary clinics can be hugely valuable. And the cardiac side of things are existing in cancer, existing cardiac collaboration and cancer collaboration models that are hugely valuable if those can be leveraged. Inspire is a closed-loop therapy. We're closed loop because we want to deliver stimulation when patients are breathing in, which mimics how the body creates tone during normal wakeful breathing, right? And so we've been able to leverage our diagnostics to gather the data that we needed to develop those algorithms, but also to validate those algorithms so that Inspire can work in a closed loop way. And it's been hugely valuable for us and our patients to do that. But simpler is sometimes better. One of the things we thought about is like, hey, why don't we have Inspire detect when patients are awake and asleep? And this is important, and it's something we are working on and will do. But when we got started in 2007, we decided that An easier way might just be to have a patient push a button when they go to bed and a different one when they wake up, and that works pretty well too. Enough cannot be said about the power of digital technology. All of the Inspire devices that are sold today are connected to what we call SleepSync, our digital patient management system, and they communicate back to that on a nightly basis. So a sleep doctor can any day open their portal and see exactly where all their patients are when they're using the product, and in the future, how they're sleeping as well. We're starting to be able to use this large data set to identify patterns and abnormalities that will allow us to think more holistically about treating these patients. So patients go to a sleep doctor because they have obstructive sleep apnea, and we can treat that. But if you're still waking up all the time because you're having a couple drinks before you go to bed, or you're not going to bed at a consistent time, you're still going to be not feeling well, right? So we have the opportunity with these kind of tools to identify some of those patterns that aren't helping patients sleep well and nudge them in the right direction. This is, I think, incredibly powerful in a practical sense, which is that if we can make a doctor's job easier in a broader sense, they're going to want to use these products more. In another sense, having access to this digital insight is super valuable to continue to grow patient access. So in our digital database, we noticed that there were doctors who were implanting patients of their own choice who were ones that were not initially recommended to be implanted by the FDA, but we were able to track the outcomes for those patients, see that their results in these more severe populations, as I'm showing you here, were as good as in the normal population. Then we went back to the FDA and said, here's what we're seeing in real-world evidence. Partnered with those clinicians who were doing it, and we're able to expand our indication to include those patients. So, in starting to wrap up, we have data that has over 100 patients at 10-year follow-up with great results. There's well over 20 years of evidence on this therapy. We have almost 300 publications and manuscripts that are out there, the vast majority of which are not sponsored by Inspire. We're still at the very early stages of changing the minds of doctors to use this therapy. It's a long and challenging process. Just because you have the evidence, just because the patients like it, the barriers and challenges of changing how the healthcare system works, how the patients flow through the systems, are very difficult. And because of that, strongly recommend thinking about these systematic, these strategic considerations so that when the time comes to get these therapies brought to market, we can do so in a more effective and simpler way. We can be more successful in getting the funding that's necessary to do that so that ultimately these innovations can get to patients. Final thing about Inspire that for me is really important is putting the patient first. So this is Dr. Glenn Nelson. He was our founding chairman of Inspire, and his wife is currently our chairman, and will be for a few more months, I think. But he always said, put the patient first, and you'll never lose your way. And this is so important, right? And I would just encourage all of us to make sure that we're thinking about that and about the power of touching people's lives and about the gift that people give us of not only their time, but their bodies to learn. It's an incredibly powerful thing, and it requires us to think deeply about what we're doing and how we're moving through the world and how we can most effectively use those gifts and that opportunity to change lives in the future. So, thank you.
I think we have the traveling microphone, so any burning questions? Okay, Alec?
So there's sort of a theme between both John and Cynthia and a little bit you, Tim, which is what patients care about in terms of how they weight risk to themselves versus burden of their disease is very different than how our regulatory panels think about this in terms of, and similarly in terms of outcomes. I mean, we all know, and this was really highlighted in terms of mental health, that the things we rate are not what patients care about, but they are the only way you can compare to an existing therapy that's on the market. Same thing as the polysomnogram. And so we get into this lovely box of, well, this is all the clinical stuff that we have used historically, and so we are just going to keep using it because that's the easiest regulatory pathway to think about. So I'm curious to all four of you, because it's a multidisciplinary question, thoughts about how we get out of the box we managed to put ourselves in?
You were nodding your head. Do you want to?
Yeah. So I think there are what you hit on are two different things. One is, does the technology work? Does it technically do what you want it to do? The second thing, and I mentioned it, is users. And users are a different issue. So whether the patients find it easy, comfortable, makes a difference in their life, makes a difference in their family, those are different kinds of questions. So for the regulator, the issue is benefit and risk, safety and efficacy. The patient response is important, but it's not the key to getting into the market. It may be the key for building the market, for getting reimbursement, for utility, but it's not about the basic safety and efficacy. So we have to think about it, but we can capture that information early. You can capture that in your initial trials and use it to continue to develop that data and to continue to grow interest and understanding in the patient population so they come and ask.
I think what Alec is trying to say is, why is that not the case?
Because benefit and risk is a measurement of safety and efficacy. And safety and efficacy doesn't necessarily mean acceptance by the patient population or the clinical population. It's an objective measure of, does the device do what you say it does, and how is that measured? Totally, they're different things. They're both important. They're both important, but they are separable. That's all I'm saying. They're separable.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought an awful lot about this, and I think that these are important components. A couple of things I want to say. It doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a yes and we wrote this in a paper more than 10 years ago in terms of looking at multidimensional assessment of outcome. The other thing that I just want to put out there, and here I'm using my kind of neuropsychology hat, is that the outcome measures that we have designed, we tend to think that they're objective, that they're assessing what is really, really important, but they're not. And we know this very clearly from neuropsychology studies and other psychological measures. They were designed and normed on primarily one group of individuals. They reflect one group's sense of values or what they think is important. And they reflect kind of Western thought in terms of like autonomy and independence is really what's most important. That may not correspond to everybody's values. So I think we need to really think critically about the measures we're using. Are they actually reflecting people's values? They're not necessarily truth with a capital T, unless you're looking at those basic core safety measures. So I'm just throwing that out there as an idea for consideration, that there are limitations in our measures. They're inherent. They reflect biases, I think, that are throughout science, and we need to just question them as rigorously as we do mechanisms of action. So I'm just putting that out there for consideration.
Yeah, I would maybe just briefly add to that, and I love what Susan and Cynthia said, so I won't repeat it, but we can also think about this as a patient population issue too, because oftentimes we're dealing with patients who don't have other options, and so if we start to say, look, these standard measures apply in this group, but we're talking about this group over there, and if we can create those distinctions, we can create more space for different measures.
That's a perfect point, and that's a scale issue, right? In that if you're looking only at the most severe, you may have problems in terms of discriminating change.
So Heather, I think, has...
Yeah, sorry. Heather Dean, FDA. So I do want to say that Susan's right. We are looking at safety and effectiveness, but I think that we are thinking about that more than just the patient perspective, but also we're starting to think more and more about the fact that we are at this critical stage in the device development. You know, we see that the device companies are hitting these chasms that Tim talked about. You know, Second Sight, he mentioned Second Sight. They got through FDA, they got a good reimbursement code, but they hadn't taken into account the market. And we are at a stage in the device development where we can advise on, you know, what are you going to need to get move forward. And that's really moving forward. My colleague Kai Kadoich is here. He's going to be speaking tomorrow as well about the TAP program, TPLC advisory program, and the fact that we are really interested in working with all of the device makers, especially of novel technologies that are treating these unmet needs. We want to make sure that the companies get to the patients, not just through the regulatory hurdles. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say we're looking only at safety and effectiveness. We're thinking more and more about how do we help you.
Question back.
Thank you all for your presentations. Cynthia in particular, I wanted to thank you for invoking Thomas Kuhn and your suggestion as to why, because it seems to me, given what we heard in the SCI population, we have a really significant challenge. The clinical pathway is varied and complex, and defining outcome measures in a wildly heterogeneous population creates real challenges. So there need to be new roads paved and new ways to think about how to address therapeutics and new strategies for spinal cord injury. So thank you, and if there's a comment from any of you on that challenge within the SCI population, I'd be interested.
Any comments, Cynthia? Make sure on SCI.
I already made my comment, and it was just supported, so I'm happy. I do think that we get stuck in rigid ways of thinking, and that's why I love pragmatism and interdisciplinarity, because it forces us to think of things in different ways. And that's what makes this exciting. And I think that, you can check out the Fins, Kubu, Mayberg et al. Paper from, I can't remember, 2017 or so, but really can we start thinking of different ways of using these data in an ethical way to transform non-responders to responders, because they've already undergone, the patient participants have already undergone the risk.
So back here.
Hi. My question for the panel is, a lot of our efforts are on kind of optimizing a therapy that maybe is 80% good enough, trying to get it closer to 100%, the ideal state. But how do we balance those efforts versus making an 80% good enough therapy more broadly available, kind of from an ethical and availability perspective?
Yes, I'd like to loop back and hear about, you're saying getting more diversity in treatments, but maybe if you start, John, with you mentioned the Inspire, click the button. So why don't you lead off, and then we'll hear from Susan and Cynthia.
Yeah, I definitely see perfect as being the enemy of the good for most of this, right? And so I would encourage you that if you have identified that population that is getting those benefits, to try to move forward, right? And if you have the right measures, that should be clear, and there's always going to be a need to continue to improve. You might think you're 80%, but once you implant those first 10,000, you realize maybe you're 70, right? And there's more work to do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would add two things to that, and one is that nothing is 100%. Nothing, your product, never. I don't think I've ever seen a product in all my years that 100% of patients had the benefit and no patients had the risks. So you have to be looking, and you have to be, as you expand your population who meet your criteria, you learn what are the other characteristics of those patients that give you more benefit, that change the risk profiles. You continue to learn, and so my advice is you have to continue to learn. And you have to be honest with both the clinicians and the patients as to what are the benefits and risks. In other words, what proportion of patients get the full benefit, so that expectations are built appropriately, both on the part of the clinical community as well as the patient community. It'd be nice if everything worked 100%, but it doesn't.
So Cynthia?
I think I largely agree with all the comments thus far, and I think you have to think about what are the underlying motivations and goals of the work that you're doing, right? And if one of the questions is looking more at mechanisms or fine-tuning, then are there different models or ways that you can address that, versus is that underarching goal really to treat as many patients as possible? and access issues as well. And so there are ethical tensions and conflict there potentially, but I think what are the underlying motivations, and are there different ways to address those goals that you have depending on what you want to achieve?
Question here.
Thank you. Dr. Kubu, thank you. Well, thank you to all the panelists for your contribution, but specifically a comment, a question. Acknowledging that DBS is decades ahead of spinal cord stimulation, can you comment on two particular considerations in spinal cord stimulation? One is off-label use in managing patient expectations. And the second is post-trial obligations that you didn't comment on, but a word or two on kind of helping the field get ahead of this concept and this question in early stages. Thank you.
Wow, nice and easy, straightforward questions, right? I think, thank you for the comments. I think that off-label use is complicated, right? Because then and we've got experts here on the panel as well as in the audience that can address this more eloquently than I can. I think that it comes down to communication. In fact, in multiple roles, I think the primary problems facing humanity is communication and poor communication. But I think making sure that you're being very clear what this may or may not do, making sure you're very clear what the potential risks may be, maybe underselling things. And that can be problematic in this world in which we've got YouTube videos, or I guess I'm dating myself, Snapchat out there, right? Or TikTok, that are showing all these miraculous cures, right? And people think that that's going to be their outcome. But I think really tempering their expectations, having frank discussions. Very pragmatically, what I do, and I've done for over 30 years, is what is it you want to achieve? How will your life be different with this surgery? Because it is an elective neurosurgical procedure. And to make sure that that does kind of align with best available data, including what's published and undergone peer review as well as clinical experience. I don't know if that addresses the question, but I would undersell rather than oversell. I think that, and I think having those very frank conversations with multiple stakeholders, we found on our team at the Cleveland Clinic, is that those goals and expectations may change over time because they meet with everybody on the team. And everybody on the team is asking those goals and expectations. So it may change over time, but you want to get a consensus. The other thing too that I think best practices are to have a multidisciplinary team meeting in which you decide surgical candidacy, especially for early trials, right? You can have an ethics monitor as well in terms of making sure that there's that disambiguation between the physician or clinician investigator versus somebody who's not invested in that. Those are some ideas off the top of my head. Post-trial obligations is a huge, huge challenge, and people have been talking about this. The only way I think to start to address that is to partner with industry, partner with healthcare and kind of hospital systems to say that that there is going to be some continued care, because these patients are undergoing a major neurosurgery. They are having a device implanted. They are contributing by helping push science forward. What are our obligations? And it's not just in terms of potential clinical benefit, but also what is that knowledge that we can learn because our patients are so generous? And how do we honor that as well? But it's going to involve a number of stakeholders coming together to figure out a solution. And I'm sorry, that's hand waving, but I honestly don't know. I hit my head against the wall every time this question comes up. I know Tim's given a lot of thought to this too, or others.
So one of my cautions on, it's an observation, moving from industry to the academic side, is I'm actually much more helping frontline with the clinicians, caring for patients day to day. And I think a lot of times when clinicians are choosing to practice a medicine as the use of a device, they don't fully understand what's behind the paper. So I think that's one of those things in terms of transparency. They see an amazing result covered on the news, and they don't understand the team that's behind the clinical trial that's actually doing that work. So they think, oh, this is great. I'm going to actually implant a spinal cord stimulator and help one of my patients. And they do it with good intent, I truly believe. They just did it naively. And then the engineers and oftentimes the industry partners will step up and try to help to close some of the treatment gaps. And so I'd say that point Cynthia raised about communication is when you're actually sharing and disseminating your work with an amazing result, think about how people are going to hear it on the other side, especially clinicians who are desperate to try to find solutions. And are you being transparent on what's really involved? The other thing that's interesting in terms of some of the off-label, I'd say take it with caution, even on-label. So part of the company I work with now does sacroanterior root stimulation for SCI patients for bladder bowel. And the technology's decades old, but the devices last for decades as well. There's 3,000 patients out there. Mean time to failure is on the order of 18, 20 years. So it's a robust, simple technology. We can't find replacement parts. So in terms of the external transceivers, so the circuits today that we're using, those are be obsolete in 5 to 10 years. And so that's the other caution I have is when you do hitch yourself up to an established technology, the long-term care pathway. I know I used to think a lot about this with the team at Medtronic. We're always thinking ahead of, okay, when people need a replacement and we're designing the next generation system, we make sure that the prior patients are actually going to be covered. And so that's where I put a little bit of my caution flag of just thinking through the overall system requirements in the short term, but also the long term.
I would just add 2 quick things. And one is when you know that your product is going to have a lot of off-label use, you need to be aware as a company, as the innovator, and understand what you need to do about thinking about that data. Some of that off-label use can help you evolve and improve your product, but you also have to be careful about understanding what those uses are and what the issues are for you as well as for patients. And that's a really important aspect of understanding. And as was already pointed out, I'm a clinician, I'm a pediatrician, and in pediatrics we use a lot of things off-label because they weren't traditionally studied in our populations. When you're dealing with that as the clinical people, so the clinicians that you work with, they need to be very aware. You need to make sure that they understand that they're using something off-label, that there are unknowns about that use, and that they need to be, it's not the one case that was done someplace that looked really wonderful that they should be concerned about. They need to think carefully because of the lack of consistency in data to support that off-label use. People need to be careful. And not all clinicians, they say, oh, it's not. There are issues that can impact their outcomes. They just need to do it with knowledge.
Yeah, it's interesting, just real quick on that, is there was a recent pediatric BCI meeting where they're trying to form a community. And one of the nurses who treats children at Evelina Children's Hospital in London showed photographs of device erosion, all the complications. I mean, they were graphic photographs, and we received very negative feedback on being so transparent about the negative side. And I think that's, to Cynthia's earlier point about you're finding the right balance, but in terms of really making it clear that in these small children, you cannot put a device that was designed for an adult and route it in the same areas. And when you break away from the established practice, that can have severe complications. So just being more transparent.
Oh, sure. I have just a quick question, too. I was just curious about your experience. So, Mr. Rondoni and Dr. Alpert, much of the data, you mentioned that your device collects a lot of data that was used to justify a new indication that was kind of real-world evidence. I'm wondering if you could kind of speak to your experience in that, because it is necessarily off-label use at that point if it's going for a new indication.
Couldn't hear the last part of your comment.
Oh, I was just saying that it is necessarily off-label use. What was your experience, in presenting that data to the FDA? How was it received? If you have any sort of overall comments, or if you could speak to that, I'd be kind of curious to hear that.
Yeah, I'll use two examples. One that I shared, which was expanding our indication from AHI of 20 to 65 to 100, right? So in that population, clinicians were choosing to implant those patients who didn't have other options in the hope that this would treat them. And once we had saw that this was a trend, we knew that we needed to inform the FDA and work with them on it. And so we brought it to them with the help of those investigators who were doing that work. And the FDA, I would say, was very, very receptive. And we had a great conversation with them. And they were supportive of it. So yeah, I would say the FDA has been a tremendous partner for Inspire since day one. So very positive experiences. Second example I'll use is actually translating our therapy to pediatric populations. So the FDA's definition of pediatric is another discussion we'll have, but some patients who were very young were implanted because they didn't have any other options, in particular patients with Down syndrome, very large tongues, right, and can't wear a mask. And some of the innovation that happened there in trying to figure out how to place these devices in those patients actually led to improvements in how we place them in the adult population and going from a 3-incision to a 2-incision approach. So that kind of off-label application, although you have to be incredibly careful about it, can lead to innovation as well. And the FDA was supportive in that case also.
And real-world data is an issue and an important one for all of us. Because it can expand our knowledge about patient populations, about the products, about safety, about all of it. So it's a matter of collecting that data, because real-world data is harder to collect because it's not a standard trial and there's no case report form that everybody is using, and people are reporting different things. But real-world data is extremely important, both for innovators, for regulators, and specifically for patients.
And one thing, and I don't think you were doing this, I just want to say, off-label, don't promote it, just for the audience, for the students, you're not promoting it. It's not that, John was out there saying, hey, let's go try this other things and give us your data. It's like, just, you got to always be front and center and stay within the label.
Thank you, John.
All right, so I think a little bit related to this, Cynthia, I really thought that your point about trying to design clinical trials that were more fluid with a little bit less defined endpoints was very interesting. But I was curious, the panel's ideas or thoughts on would that make sense for different applications you've looked at, and if so, how would you want to implement it?
You mentioned, so when you were doing your background, you said you did pilots, like orders of tens of, triangulating. And so can you speak a little more towards that, like the early stages of figuring out the therapy?
Yeah, that's a great example, Tim, thank you. At the early stages, we were unsure what patient population would be most likely to benefit from Inspire, right? And so we worked with clinicians around the world to test this in the patient populations that they felt would be most beneficial. And we also, frankly, weren't sure about a lot of things. And so in the scope of that trial, it was all comers, a lot of different techniques, and we learned which patients were more likely to respond and actually innovated in certain types of diagnostic tests that are currently used to screen patients for us. So I'm very supportive of taking that approach early on, which is to cast a very wide net, look for small signals, and then we would incrementally grow that trial. So it was 10 patients, then we say, okay, we'll do another 5, but we're gonna look at this, and we do another 5 and look at that, and the regulators were very supportive of that, and it was a very dynamic process that involved being, as Tim mentioned earlier, incredibly close to the clinical team to make those decisions and to gather those insights. I'd also highlight the need for digital tools to help accelerate this process as well. The more you can learn quickly and adapt quickly, the better you can narrow in on those groups. And I think that more broadly, you can have more effective dynamic trials if you have better information flow.
So it's doing those trials on the early side when you're first doing them. You might have a broader inclusion criteria or different populations, but you need to eventually narrow. So you need, it's a learning process. And if you go into it that way, you have to understand that it may take you a different time and it may take a different amount of patience if you're going to start broader and then narrow and
So
focus.
I understand that that's how it's done now. My question, I think, if I understood what Cynthia was saying, is that potentially that's not serving people well currently, is there a way that we should be looking at adjusting these, how we do clinical design, to get answers maybe in a way that makes more sense, right? If we have outcome measures, maybe we realize as we have a larger clinical trial that our outcome measures we came up with didn't necessarily make sense. Is there a good way to look at adjusting our expectations there as a community in conjunction with the FDA to improve our ability to deliver meaningful therapies?
Clinical trials can evolve and do. So I'm not exactly understanding, because you can design your clinical trial to evolve, either expand or narrow. You just have to communicate it and plan it. And you can plan your trials that way. There's no restriction that you have to do. You have flexibility in trial design. And I think what Cynthia was pointing out is we should be designing our trials with that flexibility and with that knowledge as to when do we want to look and what do we want to look at, and build that into our trial design.
If I could add one more thing, there's a big difference in what I've seen in different companies and how they do these trials. Very large companies tend to design a trial in a very academic way and hand it off to a team that knows very little about the application to execute it as it was written down, right? And I feel like that prevents the type of learning that you're talking about. At Inspire, especially in the early days, the people who were working on the designing of the product were right there along with the clinicians, similar to what Tim is talking about. And I think that without that kind of collaboration, the opportunities to do what you're suggesting, I think aren't there. So I do think that what you're pointing at is a very good point, that we need to think, how do we not only structure our trials that way, but how do we operate that way as an organization to allow that kind of learning to happen? Because if the insights are there, the adaptation can take place, like Susan was mentioning, but oftentimes those insights don't occur because this team working in the trial doesn't, I think, bring that innovative mindset to it.
Cynthia, did you want to add anything? Or?
I think I agree completely, and that's a common theme here, is like respecting different ways of knowing and thinking and experiences, working together more in an integrated, transparent fashion, and really kind of making sure that the patients and the families and the consumers are centered in that as well, and that way of knowing. I do think, and this is something we haven't touched on, and it may or may not be relevant too, is that there's a push to get things to market, to generate income, to do these things, and sometimes that push can prioritize doing, as careful science as maybe we could have, and how do we manage those tensions? Tim mentioned this too, is that it's going to take, 5 or 6 years for the one study he's looking at, and they're going to get scooped. What do we value as a community? Good science, good ethics, versus who's going to have that first publication. And that's a whole different kind of philosophy of academia question, but anyhow.
Yes.
Could I just add one quick thing, and that is patient-reported outcomes, PRO, are being used. And if you haven't been collecting the things that the patients tell you, you should, because they are very important and can move your product forward.
So Tay, you can...
Let's thank everybody on this panel. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.